Hello, welcome to a webinar masterclass on the cannabis and hemp industry with a specific focus on Africa. My name is Trenton Birch. I'm your host for this evening. We run Chiba Cannabis and Hemp Academy, as well as Chiba Cannabis and Hemp Consulting, doing work across the entire African continent, from DRC to Kenya to Botswana to Zimbabwe, all over the place. We love traveling to Africa. And what's really been exciting over the last few months, or the last sort of 6 to 8 months, is this surge that is starting to happen on the African continent as more countries start to wake up to the fact that we have an incredible opportunity with this plant to really drive economic development, job development, as well as actually contributing positively towards the planet through medical cannabis from a healing perspective, from industrial hemp, from all kinds of perspective, carbon credits to sustainable building to protein sources. It really is the most incredible plant. So it's really exciting to see that Africa is starting to open up to this opportunity. But if we don't know what we're doing in any sunrise industry, things don't move forward. And that's why education is so important. We are the only higher education accredited organization on the continent for cannabis, and we take education very seriously. So thank you for showing up tonight. We have over 300 people registered, so it should be a nice, busy event. I've got 3 guests that are going to come in, and I'll introduce you as we go along. We're going to do a whole section on hemp, then we're going to do a section on medical cannabis, and then we're going to do a section on product and distribution. And then at the end, we'll just have a quick discussion around where things are at in the industry. But without further ado, I'm going to start the presentation. And let's go. Right. So I think the first thing I want to just also promote is, as educators, we have a beautiful course which we launched. We've run it once this year. It's based on the back of a 12-week course which we ran on our campus. And we had people from all over Africa. You can see there we had several people from Ghana, from Botswana. We had people from America, from the UK. It's a great course. It's really deep. It goes into the entire ecosphere and value chain. It got a 4.9 out of 5, so we're really pleased with that. We will send everybody an email after this with a discount code. We have our next course starting in a few weeks' time. So if you'd like to join that and like to basically get what we're going to do in 1 hour on steroids, it's really, really worth having a look at. One thing that's really important to understand, and one of the themes for this particular webinar, is putting the market first before the plant. Everybody's focused on the plant and agriculture and growing the plant, which is a big mistake, because we can't grow something if we don't know what the market is. And if you look at traditional industries like the agricultural industry, they know what the market is because that's an established market. But we find continuously in this particular market that people are focused on the cultivation, but then have no idea what they're growing for. We have people coming to us every day who have hemp permits, who have land, who want to cultivate. They have hemp permits, and most people we speak to who have hemp permits have no idea what they are cultivating hemp for. Without a market, you have no industry. So that's the big theme of this particular talk. We're going to talk about hemp. We're going to talk about all the different iterations of hemp and exactly what that can do for society and our job creation, etc. Medical cannabis, which we must remember is pharmaceutical. So if you want to play in the medical cannabis space, there are pharmaceutical regulations. We build plant factories. It is not for everybody. It is not accessible to everybody because you are playing in the medicinal space. We've also got the adult use space. Sometimes we call it the responsible adult use space. Sometimes we call it the recreational space, when we are using cannabis, not necessarily for medical, but for other things. And then we have a category which we don't really talk enough about, I believe, which is the wellness space. So I believe you should have 3 categories for THC cannabis. It should firstly be medical, which is highly regulated. Then we should have like a complementary medicine section where you can get cannabis without having to go through a doctor for mild anxiety, for muscle pain, for sleep. And then you also get the industrial side of hemp as well. So there's a whole lot of plethora of areas that we're going to touch on in this session. And as I said, start with the market, not the plant. Okay, so we've written this backwards. So you've got the market. The market dictates your product. The product dictates certain specifications. If it's medical, it's a lot stricter than hemp. Then you've got genetics. The genetics tie back into cultivation. So the theme is to really focus on how we can make sure that we are getting it right, starting from the front and working backwards. And I think if we can get that right as a continent, we are in for a massive, massive growth over the next 5 to 10 years in this industry. Right, I'm going to introduce Moklatsi. Hi, Moklatsi, how you doing?
Evening, everyone. Hey, Trenton, how are you doing?
Good, great to see you as always. Moklatsi has been doing some incredible stuff in the hemp space, specifically in the fiber space, and has been cultivating and making bags and jackets and all kinds of amazing things, and is a beautiful example of what we can do if we put our minds to it. And starting small and doing proof of concept in order to bring in bigger investment. Sometimes people approach this industry, and if they haven't got millions of rands to start, they just don't start. That's not the kind of people we are. We believe in just getting on with it and getting started. So, Moklatsi, I have deep respect for what you've done. And I'm going to hand over to you to tell the masses what hemp is all about. Okay, over to you.
Right, 100%. Thank you for the introduction, Trenton. Really appreciate you making the time and for the platform. So today I'll be speaking about hemp, guys, and not only just speaking about hemp, but the multiple opportunities that are able to come out from the crop, right? And you can see from our slides here, one crop presents multiple industries. And I can actually even show you guys a practical demonstration of what I mean. Um, this is a hemp stalk, for example. The outside of the stalk is what you extract for the fiber, and the inside is what you use for the core, which is basically like chips, seeds, which go to other industries, and that same fiber can be used for something like textiles and fabric, right? And during my course of my presentation today, I'm going to try and break down what this all looks like, right? Because as Trenton mentioned, the most important thing is understanding your market. What are you growing for? Because that ultimately determines how you will grow your hemp for that market, right? So if you're going to grow for fiber to make textiles, there's a certain way to grow. If you're going to make hurd, like these wood chips that I just showed for composites, there's a certain way to grow. If you're going to grow for seed, so that you can make oils and different types of cosmetics, there's a certain way to grow for that. So during our presentation, we'll be discussing this at a very high level, just so that everyone can kind of get a picture of what this all looks like. So, what is hemp, right? So, I think it's very important to differentiate hemp from cannabis, right? When we're talking cannabis, you're talking about basically the fruit of the plant, right? And this is the psychoactive element of the crop, right? When someone consumes it, they basically are pursuing a certain feeling or effect, either medicinal or recreationally, right? But hemp is actually a cousin of the cannabis plant and is mainly used for industrial purposes and is non psychoactive. So, most hemp trees look identical to cannabis plants, but actually, chemically, they have two different compositions in terms of the levels of THC. So, cannabis will have a higher concentration, whereas hemp will have a very low concentration that's almost indetectable. And hemp is mainly grown for industrial purposes, as I just demonstrated through the products that I just showed, right? So it's the same crop, looks identical, but grown and used for different purposes. One medicinal and recreational, the other for industrial applications. So the hemp economy, right? You need to separate the hemp economy into multiple spheres, right? These main spheres are industrial. This includes things like construction industry. This includes stuff like your composites, your automotive industry, right? Because the fiber can actually be used similar to cotton or even polyester as binders in your car for acoustics. So when you slam your door, you hear that soft feeling, that doof that you get when you close your door. This is a perfect example of where the hemp fibers will work perfectly, right? And the fiber can also then be used for textiles like my jacket over here or this piece of fabric that you see here, right? And then construction, these same wood chips that I showed you guys here, you can actually see these are very small wood chip pieces. Those would be used as bricks. Those can be used for panels, for example. They can be used for a various array of materials in the construction industry. And then you have the seeds, right, in terms of your food and your grains, right? So the inner core of the seed actually is high in proteins and omega oils, and that is where the value is in the grain industry. So you have this vast array of industry, and it's extremely important that you, as a participant in this industry, select and choose your focus. Similar to what Greenwood has, our focus is on the textiles. You, as a farmer or as an entrepreneur, need to decide what is my focus going to be. Am I going to be going through the fiber route? Am I going to go through the food route, or am I going to go down the cannabinoid route? And that ultimately determines how you grow and who ultimately your buyer will be. So as you can see, we are now at fiber, grain, and flour. This is what we mean that your market determines how you grow, right? So fiber is grown long, big and uniform, up to 6 meters tall, so a very massive plant. Whereas your grain is grown with spacing, and mainly you're trying to get as much seed as possible so that you can make the best grain as possible. Whereas your CBD and your flour is basically cultivated in very controlled conditions. This is where you get your indoor facilities where people have to wear certain like hairnets, gloves, mouth covers, and this is because this is a material that will be ingested by people. So it's very important that you have certain licensing in place, but also your compliance and the handling of the material is also handled appropriately. And this is what we mean that your market determines how you grow, but ultimately determines your input cost depending on what market you depend to choose. So it's very important based off of your capacity, you select what is suitable for you. So density changes the plant. It's all a game of which genetic you are using and how you are growing that genetic. So, for example, this stick of hemp that you see here, the reason why it's so slim and slender is because it was grown very closely together. And that's what you want when you're growing hemp for fiber, right? But if I was growing it for seed, I would not grow them very close together, up to 1 to 2 centimeters together. I'd actually grow them up to 1 meter apart. Why? So that I can encourage the flowering process, so I can encourage as much seed yield as possible from my trees because now they have space so that they can branch out and now you can get as much seeds as possible from the shoots or the buds as people like to refer them to. So everything depends on your density and how you grow for your different markets. So harvest is also dependent by the product. So for fiber, you basically cut it, you bale it, and you send it through a vast array of mechanical processes to make the fiber almost compatible or similar to cotton, essentially. And you are basically blending that hemp and that cotton together to make a fabric, like you see over here, as I keep referring to. It's just a good visual so that you can understand what that actually looks like, right? And then when you're talking about the grain, you will actually be taking these seeds, removing the outer core, and then blending that with other conventional feeds like soy, like maize, and then almost making a type of superfood that can be used for your chickens, for your bulls. And obviously now it's completely harvested differently, right? You are focusing on cutting the flowers, you are focused on them drying appropriately, you want your seeds to be nice and mature, and you want them to have that vigor so that you can get the best yield from your seeds, right? Whereas your CBD, you want that controlled environment so that the chemical composition of the crop can increase in terms of CBD content, right? So there's a lot of curing, there's a lot of trimming, and also extraction of that flower in order to get the highest quality oils or CBD. So how does the hemp supply chain work? So it always starts with your genetics. That genetics then again links to a farmer, then again links to a primary processing, and then that primary processing ultimately determines where you can distribute it. So processing allows you to open up a vast array of industries. If I'm able to process the stick into the chips, into fiber for fabric, there's already a supply chain that starts to develop, right? And this is the important thing that needs to be understood is that you do not want to grow without knowing where your material is going to flow into, how much you're going to be paid for it, and who's going to be buying it ultimately at the end of the day. So understanding the supply chain is extremely important. And this is an example of just the complexity behind the industry and the need for a focused way of thinking before you even think about putting a seed in the ground. On the bottom, you can see, as I just explained, mainly the hemp value chain, but towards the top, you can actually see the medicinal cannabis industry. So there's a vast array of industries and applications and areas that you can play. It's just important that you are extremely focused and streamlined in what you want to do. So who is buying it? Ultimately, it's up to you to determine that, right? You need to figure out who will be buying it based off of your focus. For example, like Greenwood Hemp, we know we sell fabric, so we need to go speak to the retailers. We need to go speak to designers. We need to go speak to mills. We need to go speak to weavers. We need to go speak to everyone in the textile value chain to truly understand what specification are you looking for, what quantity, what quality. And ultimately, this applies to all the other industries, whether that's herd. So for your composites, for your animal bedding, that is something that you have to determine with your guys actively working with chickens, actively working with horses. What are their requirements? When you're talking of making grain or CBD, you need to understand how much liters of oil are they looking for, at what frequency, and if that will ultimately determine your cultivation practices. I'm going to now hand over to Max to speak a little bit more about the medicinal cannabis industry and leverage Chiba's magnificent expertise here on this one.
How's it, Moklatsi? I can't believe you did the hemp industry in 15 minutes. Well done. That's a feat without a doubt. I think I love this slide. I just think this just really encapsulates the cannabis plant. You got the genetics in the beginning, the different iterations of what you're doing, and then the downstream. I often say that you can't really consider cannabis an agricultural industry. Yeah, the agriculture is the catalyst, but if you look at the amount of different products that can be made from the plant, you have to encapsulate the entire ecosphere. So the agriculture might be the catalyst and the starting point, but it's not. Cannabis and hemp is not an agricultural industry. It touches so many different areas. So I think it's important to caveat that. What advice would you give to somebody who has a hemp permit right now, and sort of are a bit stuck in terms of what to do?
I think right now, if you do have a hemp permit, or even if you don't, your main tool right now is education, education, education. So, going to Chiba, actually getting their certificate, registering with their course, coming to Greenwood Hemp Industries, for example, registering for our course because we offer offtake for hemp farmers. So, find what your game plan is, find what your focus is, and the only way you can determine that is education, because then ultimately that will allow you to know what your capacity is, what you can do, and where you can participate. And I think that's extremely important.
Absolutely. Great. Well said. Mokhlati, thanks so much. We'll see you at the end for a discussion. Right, I'm going to hand over to Wes. Wes is from Athena BioLeaf Technologies and a partner in Chiba Cannabis and Hemp Consulting. And he's going to take you through the magical, complex world of medical cannabis.
Yeah.
Over to you, Wes.
Yeah, good evening, everybody, and thanks, Trenton, for the platform. And yeah, happy to try and navigate through this quite sometimes controversial, but it's we break it down simple so people can understand. But yeah, it's a very technical aspect of cannabis. But yeah, it's good, and I think it definitely deserves its place in the world, and we should have been doing this many years ago, not only starting now in South Africa and the rest of Africa. But yeah, so I mean, ultimately we got to understand. Well, I mean, Moklatsi spoke about cannabis or hemp, cannabis sativa. Medical cannabis is basically medical or medicinal cannabis. For me, they're much in the same, but it depends on the path that you want to go. So who you're producing the product for. But medical cannabis in the pharmaceutical sense is basically growing cannabis, and we would normally categorize this as THC cannabis. So higher THCs, not CBD, not hemp, but THC that is above 2% in South Africa would be classified as cannabis. So medical cannabis for pharmaceutical, it means that we're growing a pharmaceutical product and then manufacturing it into or processing it into a pharmaceutical grade product, which then comes with its whole complexities, which we'll go through now. So what is the difference? Why is it different to hemp and all that sort of stuff? Well, we must remember that the cannabis that we're talking about in this topic here, medical cannabis, needs to be fit for human consumption. So when anything is fit for human consumption, same as like when you go to a Woolies or a Spar and you go and buy something off the shelf, a canned product, there's a batch barcode, a batch number, all that sort of stuff. You need to have some sort of traceability, so, and also consistency. So consistency, when you go to a pharmacy and you go and buy a Panado, or you go to a garage and you buy a Panado, you know that if I take one Panado, this is the effect that I'm going to have. If you take 10 Panados, this is the effect that I'm going to have. But the Panado is exactly the same all the time. And that's where the consistency comes in, batch by batch by batch. So, there's quite a huge number. I think the total cannabinoids that they've actually found in cannabis is around about 57. I think we only monitor about 18 or 19 cannabinoids. We all know the famous three, that's THC, CBD, and CBG. There's quite a number of other cannabinoids. And then terpenes. Terpenes are all the aromas and stuff like that. So you can think about, when it comes to consistency, if you've got, let's say you're growing from seed, so you've got seed off the, so you got the one female plant, you've got a male plant, you pollinate them together, they can make, let's say, 5,000 seeds. If you take those 5,000 seeds and go and all germinate them, that's the same genetic, 5,000 of the same genetic. 50% of them will be male, 50% will be female. But out of the 50%, so 2,500 females, there'll be 2,500 different phenotypes. So although they're the same genetics, they're not twins. They're non-identical twins, and they all come up with their own terpene profiles and cannabinoid profiles. So this is where consistency becomes difficult, because we now need to go from clones, and then it's about rooms and the temperatures of rooms and humidities and all that sort of stuff. So the thing about medical cannabis, yes, it's cannabis and it's relatively easy to grow, but from a medical point of view, we need to be consistent, and that's where the complexity comes in. And then I spoke about earlier about having a barcode or a batch number and all that sort of stuff. So it's about traceability. Remember, a pharmaceutical product, if you ingest something and you have a negative reaction to it, you need to be able to understand, well, what's causing it, and then go back and follow all the dots and the chain of evidence, the traceability from the actual mother, and then, what starting material was used, what type of nutrients were used, where's the COA, all this sort of stuff. So that's where traceability comes into it. And then to have the traceability and the consistency, all of this is achieved through documentation. So SOPs, standard operating procedures. How do we do it? So if I've got a facility that's with 20 different people, each person will be a multi-skilled, but they will have their preferred job profile or job spec. But if I've got let's say 10 trimmers, they all need to be able to be trimming exactly the same and grade the product exactly the same. So there's a standard operating procedure that everybody needs to adhere to. And that's the only way that we can have consistency, is that if everybody's trained correctly with the right SOPs and doing it correctly, then we know that there's going to be consistency amongst the trimmers, or in terms of the people in the cultivation. So who's running the irrigation and how we set that up. So there's certain SOPs. So SOPs basically just guides all your employees within the cultivation space or in the GMP space, manufacturing, to run the same process from start to finish. How do I get from A to B? I have to go through all these steps. Can be 3 steps, it can be 20 steps, but everybody has to follow those steps. And then we mentioned documentation, so batch records, so everything needs to be recorded. Like I actually had a funny discussion this morning with one of the facilities that we work with, and he sent me a picture. He showed me a picture of a genetic mutation that he picked up off his. I think he had 4,000 plants in the ground, and he only and they're all coming from clones. And these 2 plants had a very distinct genetic formation or just an extra growth coming out. And for me, it's like, where did that clone come from and which mother was it? And now we can trace back and have a look at how many clones we got off that mother. And then we can identify all those clones and see if those clones are predisposed to the same genetic trait. And if it is, and we don't like it, well, then we've got to get rid of the mother. So, and the only way we can do that is through documentation, checking, that's traceability, all the documentation, deviation logs, etc., etc. And then also in terms of the security thing, which I understand, because cannabis or THC, once it's packaged, it becomes a Schedule 6 drug. At the moment, still a Schedule 6, and that's the same as any narcotic. So it has to be strictly controlled from a security point of view, as well as a quality assurance point of view, contamination. We're all doing these things to make sure that the product is correct. And all of this ties back to consistency. So when we do a COA on a specific batch, that we're going to, let's say we're doing, Gorilla Glue number 4, which is a specific genetic. Okay, so this batch for me that's going overseas has a specific cannabinoid profile and a specific terpene profile. So we do the COA. The off-taker knows that COA, they're happy with that profile of terpenes and cannabinoids. But now the next batch, we've got to make sure that we stick to the same methods so that we can achieve the same or very similar COA with not many deviations. So that's where we are. Did I change that? Okay, cool. So again, where do we start for all of this? At the end of the day, we've got to, we can't just hope and pray and, okay, well, get some seeds from somebody, get some clones from somebody and just pop them in the facility and, okay, we're just going to grow and somebody's going to buy it somewhere down the line. In the medical space, we've got to identify who the customer is. That's number one. What are we growing, who the customer is, and what do they want? And then which country is it going to? Is it going to Australia, for example? So there's different rules and regulations for product that has to go into to Australia versus the EU versus Macedonia versus Switzerland, all these sort of stuff. So there's different regulatory frameworks that we need to overcome, which is also going to directly impact the type of facility and the style of growing that we're going to have to adopt, because it depends on the country. And then the product, are we doing flower, are we doing hash, are we doing trim, are we doing small buds, big buds, all that sort of stuff. So we need to understand the type of product, and then we go and have a look at the specifications down the line in terms of we've identified the customer, what are we actually going to be selling them, and then where are the specifications. It needs to align to this terpene profile, and it has to have a THC percentage of between 24 and 26%. So those sort of things. So that's where we are. In terms of genetics become a production point, absolutely. I've already spoken about the chemical profile. I've spoken about the cannabinoids, the potency, the terpenes. Now, the combination of the cannabinoids and the terpenes is what create the entourage effect. So you can have a specific strain that has a very low THC content, okay? So the potency can be perceived as very low, but because of the terpene profile, that thing can, so the entourage effect, so the terpene and the cannabinoid effect on the body together can create a very, very potent concoction or formulation, which can really, really, really affect somebody in both good and bad ways. So potency is not necessarily just about the THC level, okay? It's also about how the terpene profile matches the cannabinoid profile, and that's what gives you your entourage effect. And then we look at agronomic performance. This is pure agriculture. what is the yield I'm going to get? What does the bud structure look like? How long is the flowering time, which is hugely important. Sometimes you get a 6-weeker plant, sometimes you get an 8-weeker plant, up to a 12-weeker plant. Now, those things are critically important to understand and know, because it's going to directly impact your design of your facility, because you can't be running 8-week setup, so 4 flowering rooms with the veg room, and try and have a perpetual cycle when now all of a sudden I've got a genetic that takes 12 weeks to flower, because something's going to be out of sync. So yeah. And then in terms of the commercial fit, consistency, we've spoken about market demand. When we're growing medical cannabis, or when we're growing cannabis, we want to grow it so we can have a return of investment. We're investing in assets, we're investing in infrastructure, all that sort of stuff. We have to pay staff, so there's investment made. So the commercial fit has to make sense. Now, if there's no demand for your specific product, you're never going to sell it. So that's very, very important. And again, this is where the buyer specification alignment comes in. So, we need to have all of these things aligned to be able to have a commercial operation. And then again, if we don't have a stable genetic, so let's say, for example, we've got a genetic that's predisposed to high heat stress, and we go through a couple of days of high heat in a greenhouse, there's a good chance that if the genetic is not stable, that plant can actually become a hermaphrodite and start herming, what we call herming, and it will push out some pollen sacs. And if that's not caught, or that happens, and there is pollen inside those sacs, and it does explode, what we're going to do is we're going to have seeds throughout the entire greenhouse or outdoor. So that's very, very important to have stable genetics. All right, and then a lot of you guys have heard the acronyms GACP and GMP. GACP stands for Good Agricultural Practices, and GMP is Good Manufacturing Practices. So majority of the facilities, all the facilities ultimately in a cultivation stage have to run in good agricultural practices. Now, that GACP is not unique to cannabis. GACP also is in the vegetable industry, the fruiting industry, and all that sort of stuff. And what is it about? It's about also having batch control, also having knowing where your starting material comes from, traceability, all that sort of stuff. So if you not just cannabis, like if you're growing, let's say tomatoes, or let's say potatoes, potatoes grow in the ground and all that sort of stuff. But because of the 99% of them are derived from tissue culture, if that tissue culture that you receive to propagate your little bulbs is contaminated, you might have an infection throughout your entire crop of your stuff. So this is where GACP comes into play, is where we've got traceability from starting material, and we've got to follow certain practices, hygiene, make sure there's no weed, there's some pest control, all that sort of stuff. So that's where GACP fits in. In terms of the GMP side, so the manufacturing side, there's 2 types of manufacturing where GMP comes in. So once you've harvested your product, it comes out of GACP and moves into the drying room. That starts becoming what we call the start of the GMP process. And then we also have that once the product is dried and trimmed and it wants to be processed even further, so we're going to be processing it into extract, for example, THC distillate or THC isolate. That becomes what we call a manufacturing process. So there's a whole different lot of SOPs and different area designs and infrastructure designs to make sure that we consistently getting the same end product from a manufacturing point of view. That's exactly the same as your panados and stuff like that. You grow it in very sterile environments, and you got to have no contamination. So we talk about contamination controls, proper quality management systems, so there's full traceability on the manufacturing side. Because remember, this product becomes needs to be fit for human consumption, so that's hugely important. And which GMP standard does your market require? Very, very, very important. So in South Africa, we're in South Africa at the moment. That's where we're doing this webinar from. Our regulator is SAPRA, South African Health Professions Regulatory Authority. So they will issue you, when you apply for your Section 22C license, you will receive a GMP certificate with it, okay? But it doesn't mean that it's aligned with EU GMP or other GMPs. It's aligns with PICS. So SAPRA is our regulatory body. But normally, if we are going to the EU, like if we want to distribute or sell our product directly into the EU, and you want to package for the EU, destined EU in South Africa, you need to be EU GMP certified, which is a whole different ballgame. The facility makes up 40 to 50% of the EU GMP. So that's infrastructure, so your validations on equipment and validations on air handling and the cascade effect of your air movement, etc., etc.
Sorry to interrupt you. We are running out of time, so you've got 3 minutes. So you might.
Oh, shit. Okay, cool.
The clock is ticking.
Okay. Cool. So ultimately, the infrastructure counts for 40% of the EU GMP, and 60% is all your paperwork. Okay. Cool. Then building the plant factory. Again, we got to start at the entrance and move the product. So people and product all have to follow one flow. We can't be going back on itself, especially the product. The product has to go in from one. The flow needs to go in from one side and then not backtrack on itself, because that's where we have a risk of cross-contamination and stuff. So the flow has to start from coming into the facility from the veg room, the mother plants, the clones, veg room, flowering room, harvest, drying room, trimming room, curing room, and then dispatch. And it all needs to flow in one direction. And within all of these things, you need your different environmental systems and control systems. So yeah. Facility design, again, this is the process that we're talking about: access control, personnel movement. These are all the things that we need to consider when we build or design a facility. How do we move material around? What are the environmental controls? Air handling, cleaning, pest management, security, waste management, and segregation of different zones. So pretty self-explanatory, but these are the things that go into medical cannabis. And then quality is built into the facility. So if you've got a bad SOP and people are following the bad SOP from a trimming point of view, that's going to directly affect your quality, your end quality. So you've spent 12, 13, 14 weeks growing the most beautiful flower, and everything gets damaged right at the end when they're trimming. So, that's where quality is built in, is quality SOPs. And then training those SOPs, and then collaboration. So making sure calibrations, not collaborations, calibrations of all the equipment. So sensors, temperature sensors, humidity, all that sort of stuff. If they're not calibrated correctly, then we're just in the dark completely. Market access is not automatic. So, you've got a SAPRA license. That's just the beginning of the journey. We need to know what the import requirements are. We need to know what the products specifications and testing are. What are the quality standards to where you're sending your products? Then we have to apply for an export permit. Before we can apply for an import permit, we need to have an import permit from the other country, and then buyer qualifications, because everybody says they've got money, but when you want to send your product and they don't have money, then you've produced product for a person that doesn't have money. You sit with a big problem. Sorry. And the medical cannabis trap, quite important. License doesn't automatically mean that you've got a customer. Crop doesn't automatically mean that you've got a sale. GMP doesn't automatically mean you've got market access. and product capacity doesn't always mean that you've got the demand. So it's always playing with all of these sort of things, but you've got to start at the end and work your way back in this industry. Okay, Trenton, was that fast enough for you?
Well done, Wes. I know it's a lot to get through. I know you and I can talk about medical cannabis for days. So well done. I think the whole point of this is, this is a very, very high level masterclass, guys. It's all about the different segments. For those of you who are interested in getting into the industry or are dabbling in the space, it's important to understand that, medical cannabis is very complex. Thanks, Wes. We'll see you just now. Appreciate it. We're going to move on to Mags, who is with Chiba, and I'm going to hand it straight over to you to talk about consumer products, packaging, clubs, dispensaries, all those kind of crazy things. Over to you.
Yeah, you guys will see that I've got the tree. Thank you very much for that, and I appreciate the platform. You guys will see that I have a big smile on my face because I'm super, super passionate about the cannabis club space. Incidentally, it was my first entry point into the cannabis industry. So, up until this point, we've spoken quite a lot about the plant. We've spoken about cultivation, genetics, medical production, and the agricultural side of things. But ultimately, a plant that's sitting in the field is not really a consumer product. So this is where I want to shift the conversation a little bit. So the question for me is, what do we actually do with the plant once we have it? Because the value chain doesn't stop with cultivation. We can extract it, we can formulate it, we can manufacture the plant, we can package it, and then we can distribute it, and ultimately put the product into the hands of the consumer based on our distribution channels. And every one of these steps creates a different business opportunity for us. But also very, very important, it creates a different regulatory and quality requirement as we go through this process. So in this section, it's really about moving from cannabis as a crop to cannabis as a consumer product. And I'll show that to you as we go along with the slides. So there's also a very important commercial principle here, that the closer that we get to the consumer, the more important the product experience becomes for them. That means we're no longer asking how much cannabis we can produce, but we're asking the question around what are we actually solving for the customer and what are we actually putting into the market? What format makes sense for them? What legal route allows you to take that product to market as well? All right, moving on to the next. Cannabis is not just flower. And for me, this is probably one of the most important slides in this section, because when people hear about cannabis, they automatically think flower. But flower is just one possible format, and it's the starting point of the entire journey. The same plant, like you can see on here, can ultimately become oils, tinctures, capsules, edibles, vapes, topicals, extracts, and a whole range of other secondary processed products. And here's the important commercial point again for you guys, is that every one of these formats effectively is also a different business. Different manufacturing process, different equipment, different quality requirements, different consumer, different regulatory classification, and potentially a completely different route to market as well. So if you're thinking about entering the cannabis industry, you shouldn't simply be asking how much cannabis I can grow. If I were you, I'd be asking the question, what product am I ultimately trying to put into the market and what am I solving for? Because that answer should influence everything upstream, from genetics to cultivation through to processing, packaging, and then ultimately distribution. If I know I'm ultimately making a standardized oil as an example, my raw material requirements are very different from someone that's making premium flower as an example. If I'm making a food product, I have a totally and a completely different manufacturing and quality conversation again. So the product, again, like we've heard throughout this entire conversation, is that the product should drive the supply chain and not the other way around. So as we move away from the topic of flower, extraction becomes one of the major value-added opportunities that we can look at. And extraction isn't just one thing either. As you can see on the screen, you can have relatively minimally processed extracts, full spectrum, all the way down the chain to highly refined isolates. And you've got everything in between, like resin, rosin, waxes, and badders, and shatters, and distillates and stuff, as an example. So, for me, when we're starting to move away from agriculture and into processing, the entire game changes. And like I said, the processing and what we're going to be mindful of in terms of quality and the standards that we implement have to be considered in terms of where we're going with this. And for me, that's important because the economics can change dramatically as you move down the value chain. As you heard from Mashlatsi and the guys as well, they've been talking about the raw product and then manufacturing. For me, the raw agricultural material becomes an input into a much more sophisticated product when you start looking at extracts and concentrates. But something to be very, very mindful and cognizant of is that sophistication brings a huge amount of responsibility as well, because you need to understand in depth. You need to understand the extraction technology, formulation, testing, stability, criticality, and what market you're actually producing for. There's various ways of doing extraction as well. And I think the two main headline topics would be solventless and solvent type of extraction. You don't extract something as well just because you simply can. You need to extract because you need to know what market you're going with, what specification the product needs to meet, and also a very, very important thing, and Wes touched on this here, is who is going to buy the product. And this, again, is another example of the principle that we've been talking about throughout the entire masterclass. Start with the market and then work backwards. Exactly the same holds true for the cannabis club market and for the retail market as well. Okay, moving on to manufactured cannabis products. And for me, I think this is where the industry becomes particularly interesting. Once we move into manufactured products, we're no longer really talking about farming, are we? We're talking about product development, which is something that really excites me, and we talk about manufacturing at the same time as well. So think beyond flower and think about the oils, think about the tinctures, think about capsules, think about the edibles, think about vapes, and also topicals. Each one is there to solve a different consumer need. Depending on the type of consumer that you are, you may choose one of these or various of these items to satisfy what you want to achieve out of cannabis consumption. So as an example, oil is there and it's there for controlled dosing. A capsule gives you standardized dosing in a very, very familiar pharmaceutical type of format. If you look at the edible market, this puts cannabis into a food type of experience. And vapes, which is such a massive market at the moment in terms of extracts, this provides inhaled or vaporized delivery. And then we look at topicals, which is an entirely different application altogether and addresses a whole other host of conditions that can be treated with cannabis. But here's the common denominator when you're looking at the retail market, is that the consumer expects consistency across the entire value chain. So what do I mean by that? What I mean is that if I buy a product today and if I buy it again next month, I expect it to behave in exactly the same way. And that's the reason why the consistency is so important when we're speaking about this. So what does consistency mean, and how do you actually make sure that you are consistent across the entire value chain, from cultivation through extraction all the way through to distribution? For me, it means standardizing on the formulation that you want to use, dosing, stability, testing, and manufacturing controls, which also become incredibly important as you move down this value chain. So let me give you an example so I can highlight what I'm trying to say. So if you take an edible, for an example, you don't want one piece to contain significantly more of the active ingredient, being THC or any other cannabinoid, compared to another piece that's in there. With capsules, as an example, the dose needs to be consistent from unit to unit. And for me, this is the reason why manufacturing discipline becomes so important as we move down the value chain. The further we move away from raw flower towards finished consumer products, the more we're moving away from simply being a cultivator towards being a consumer-led type of manufacturer. All right, packaging is part of the product, and this is intentionally titled the way that it's titled. The reason being is that I think people sometimes treat packaging as an afterthought. And for me, it really shouldn't be that. Packaging has to be part of the product development lifecycle. Packaging is there and it creates there's a few different reasons why we look at packaging, right? So it's got to be there to, number one, protect the product. It has to maintain stability. It has to prevent contamination. It needs to provide traceability. And we heard from Wes the reason why traceability is important, especially within the medical space. And it needs to also communicate dosing and consumer information. And for me, this is probably like one of the biggest things. As we get new people that are entering the cannabis consumption industry, we need to be very, very clear in terms of what we are actually putting out to the market. What's the actual dose? How can they use it? And what are the actual restrictions by actually using that product? So, again, depending on the product and the jurisdiction that you are part of, you may need various things to adhere to. So an example, you may need tamper evidence and child-resistant type of packaging, which is something that you've got to be mindful about. So again, for me, packaging isn't simply about what color should the box be. It needs to be part of the product's quality, the safety, compliance, and the end consumer experience as well. And from a commercial perspective, packaging is also one of the first things that the customers interact with. Before they experience the product, the packaging is something that will hit the eyes first. So you've got two things happening simultaneously when you're looking at this. The packaging has to protect the product technically, like I've mentioned, but it also has to communicate what the product is commercially and what's inside of that bottle. And in cannabis, that communication becomes even more important because of all of the unregulated stuff that we see floating around within the clubs and the dispensaries and stuff these days. Consumers need to understand what they are buying, how much they are getting, what they are getting, how to use it, and what the relevant warnings and limitations are that are associated with that product. So when you're designing a product, here's my advice to you. Packaging shouldn't be the last conversation that you're having. It should be part of the product development life cycle and a conversation that's had from the beginning. All right, moving on to some interesting topics now. So there's three ways of thinking about the consumer market, and I think this is where we get into the South African context of things, and it's the only context that I can speak about in terms of what the actual consumer market is. And this is where we need to be very, very careful in terms of the terminology that we actually use, because there isn't one thing called the cannabis market. There's different frameworks operating alongside each other that currently exist in South Africa. You've got the private or the adult use, like you heard Trenton mention. You've got the club and the informal market, and you've also got the medical pathway. So I'll unpack this in the slides to come. The important thing here is that these are not interchangeable with each other. Private adult use doesn't automatically mean commercial retail trade is legal. I know that the club market exists and there's many, many clubs around there, but it operates in an area of significant legal uncertainty and a bit of a gray zone at the moment. And then you have the medical pathway, which is a lot more clearly defined, but also has a lot more demanding regulatory and quality requirements when you're operating within that space. So for me, when somebody says, is cannabis legal in South Africa? My response generally is, which part of cannabis are we actually talking about here? Because the answer can also change depending on whether you're talking about possession, private use, cultivation, manufacturing, medical supply, and also commercial sale of the product. For me,
it's me being annoying. We're going to run out of time, so mine's just speeding it up a little bit.
You want me to talk faster, eh? All right, cool. Let me move along. So let's get into cannabis clubs. Something that I'm very, very curious about, and you guys can post something onto the chat box on the slide. How many cannabis clubs do you think exist in South Africa at the moment? Cannabis clubs have become a very, very visible part of the South African cannabis landscape. Wherever you look, you'll always find a cannabis club either in a shopping center or in these retail spaces or in private spaces. But for me, the visibility mustn't be confused with legal certainty and how these clubs actually run. There are many clubs and they member-based models with cultivating members that are part of the ecosystem where the cultivators cultivate, but everything is distributed within the member base that these guys are part of. But again, the legal framework around commercial cannabis activity, it remains very, very unsettled, and there is no sort of legal mandate at this point in terms of the commercial sale within South Africa. And this for me is important for anybody operating within the space, because you can't just say that because you're running a private club, then automatically whatever you're doing is legal within that space. There's many questions around commercial activity, cultivation, supply, consumer protection, and testing and traceability that needs to happen within these spaces. So I'm just gonna cut this short because I don't have much time as well. So the advice that I would give anyone that's looking to enter the space is to understand exactly what you are relying on, where you are getting the information, what the legal position is, and what the risks are before you actually invest into this space. So moving on,
we've run out of time, but if you could just touch on this the Section 21 thing first, and then we'll crack on.
Yeah, so this is a very, very important thing for me. And, myth busting is the correct title of the slide here, because you'll hear the phrase in South Africa, Section 21 dispensary. But Section 21 is not a dispensary license. Section 21 is a mechanism under the Medicines Act that allows a treating practitioner to request SAPRA authorization for access to an unregistered medicine for a specific patient. So the pathway is very, very different from saying, I've got a Section 21 license, therefore I can operate a cannabis dispensary. The process is very, very tight and very, very governed. It involves a doctor, a patient, application, SAPRA authorization, and then lawful supply of the authorized medicine. So I'm going to pause there with Section 21T.
Cool. I think we've got a few minutes left. I know this is a lot to get through, so sorry to keep butting in and asking you to hurry up. It's I know it's not ideal, but the whole point is this is a masterclass in the entire industry, and we only have an hour. So I think thank you very much for your commitment and to compartmentalizing these different sectors. I just want to ask you, we've only got a few minutes left, so I'm just going to ask a question. Wes, maybe we can start with you. What do you think are what's the key aspect that you think needs to happen on this continent to catalyze this industry properly? There's lots of countries coming online at the moment, but it's slow. Legislation, as we know, is appallingly slow in South Africa. What do you think we need at just high level to move this industry forward?
Trenton, I think what we need in this continent is for everybody to start working together. I think one thing that I've noticed is that everybody wants to, operate in silos and all that sort of stuff. But the cannabis industry and the market is so big. I mean, what Germany is at 270 tons for this year. They'll finish on close to 300 tons this year. And 3 years ago, they were at 78 tons. So, I mean, that's just Germany alone. There wouldn't be any competition. There shouldn't be any competition because people are growing different genetics, different strains, all that sort of stuff. But what we do need to do is we need to come together. We need to collaborate. We need to work together. We need to stand up together and not let other people, brokers, dictate the price and all that sort of stuff. That's where the market's going. And that's a big, this market contraction is real. And the cultivators are always in the agricultural industry.
I'm going to stop you there. Sorry, we're running out of time. Maklatsi, what do you say?
I'd say for everyone in the crowd, do your research before you put any seed in the ground and understand exactly what it is you're growing for. I think that would be my advice. And the pie is big enough for everybody, and there's multiple opportunities. Just pick your focus.
Work together. I love it. I love market. Mags, parting shot.
I think my biggest advice to anyone looking at getting into the cannabis club or the cannabis retail space within South Africa is that grow your own weed and do not buy any dumped facility weed, because that completely erodes what we're trying to do as a South African market.
And don't buy weed from Thailand, please.
There we go. Exactly that. So there's a lot more that I would say, but I would pause it there. And if you want to hear more, you guys have my details and my email address. So yeah, reach out.
Great, guys. We'll send you links to the video so that you can rewatch it. Sorry that it was so rushed. Lots of information, but hopefully it was beneficial. The African cannabis and hemp industry are on the rise, and we're very excited about the future that it holds as the rest of the world comes online. We do believe that Africa can be one of the bread baskets of cannabis and hemp into Europe. We just need to work together, know our stuff, and move this forward in a unified fashion. Gents, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. We'll see you very soon.